All right, so I think we're going to get started. I see at least one person is still working on audio. Hopefully that'll get sorted out. In the meantime, I want to thank you all for joining me today. Again, if you have any problems hearing or you're having technical issues or you have a question, please don't hesitate to interrupt me. You can ask questions by clicking the raise your hand button or by typing something into the chat. If you don't get a response from me right away, just give me a minute or two to follow up on it because it does pop up on my screen. So I will try and be as responsive as possible as we go through, and I want to make sure that I'm answering your questions as we're talking about a particular subject. So feel free to break in as needed. In case you didn't know where you are, we are in grantee orientation, which means that I get to give all of you a big congratulations, first of all, because if you are here and you are listening to this session, that means that you were successful in getting a Maryland Heritage Areas Authority grant for fiscal year 14, and not 13 as my slide says there. I just noticed that typo. But anyway, congratulations. It's always a very competitive process, and so you should feel really good about yourself for achieving that. We've got a lot of ground to cover. For the most part, if you're on this call, it means you've had a grant with us before. So a lot of this will be review. It's always good to review what you know to make sure you're doing things the right way. But we also have some new requirements and some changes to process. And we're also going to talk a little bit about the future of grant applications here at the Heritage Areas program as well. So we've got a lot of, I won't say fun stuff to cover. We've got a lot of important stuff to cover. So hopefully we can get this through in a painless fashion, but please do ask questions as we go if I'm not being clear on any of these points. So what it comes down to is we are here to ensure good stewardship of state funds because, of course, you have received a state grant, and we need to make sure that you and we are being good stewards of those funds. And to do that, we need to make sure that we follow our processes because, of course, we are a state agency, and unfortunately that does come with a great deal of bureaucracy. But we try and make that as painless as possible. And we work very close with you to ensure that that is the case. So what I want to do, first of all, is just give you a quick reminder of how this process works. You should all have gotten an award letter back in July. If, for whatever reason, you did not get an award letter, would you please send me a quick email and let me know, and we'll make sure you get a copy of that because it must have gotten lost in the mail. Hopefully that didn't happen. Obviously, you all know about your awards because you're here, so hopefully you have the award letter. And take a look at that award letter because it does include conditions that are tied to your grant award, and we want to make sure that you're aware of those from the get-go. So you've gotten the letter, but now it's September, and of course, not a whole lot has happened since you got that award letter. And what I want to do, first of all, is just go over why that is and what the process is and why it takes so long. So right about now, you may be hearing from your project monitor. It may be Mary Alexander, who's pictured here, looking very excited. She's pretending she's a new grantee. It may be myself. It may be Richard Hughes. It may be Mel Deal. Each of you has a different project monitor. We try and match them up based on each monitor's interests. But hopefully in the next few weeks, they will be contacting you to get updated information about your project. Because of course, you all applied for these grants back at the beginning of the year, and things have probably changed in the subsequent 9 months. So we want to make sure as we're creating your grant agreement that we have the most current and up-to-date information as possible, particularly as it relates to timetable and budget and scope. So you will be having that conversation with your project monitors. Then in October, you may receive a grant agreement to sign, and I've got a little asterisk because this year we are behind schedule. We have a new attorney, and they are revising our grant agreement boilerplate, which is taking longer than anticipated. So unfortunately, that means there's a delay in processing everyone's grant agreements. And we do have to process each grant agreement individually. So while we'll hopefully start getting them out in October, it may take until the end of the year before you have a grant agreement to look at. And again, we apologize for the length of time, but as you'll see in the next couple of slides, there are quite a few steps in that process which create this sort of long timeline. And again, as we've said in previous years, you need to be aware that you may not be seeing a disbursement check until the new year, so you need to plan accordingly if that is the case. And just as a reminder, again, part of the reason this takes so long is that there are a lot of different players that are involved. Of course, you've gotten a grant from the Maryland Heritage Areas Authority, which is an independent state unit. The authority is staffed by staff from the Maryland Historical Trust in the form of Richard and I. And we fall under the Maryland Department of Planning. And the authority's chair is the Deputy Secretary of Planning, Amanda Kahn. And she's new. You may have worked with Matt Power in the past. Amanda is our new chair. So we have sort of a trifecta of organizations that work together with the Heritage Areas program. In addition to that, within the Maryland Historical Trust, there are different units, and Richard and I fall in the Office of Preservation Planning and Museum Program. But many of you, particularly those of you with capital projects or projects that involve archaeology or ground disturbance, will also be working with our Office of Preservation Services where they deal with compliance and easements. And we will be talking about that later on in the presentation. But I want you to be aware that when it says MHT, yes, we're all one larger organization, but there are distinct units. And what happens in preservation planning and museum programs is different than what happens in preservation services. And while we speak to each other and we work closely with each other, we don't have the same decision-making processes. So you need to be aware that you may be working with two different arms. The other group that we work with, of course, is our legal counsel in the form of the Office of the Attorney General. And that's obviously particularly important as we craft these grant agreements. So what does it take to get a grant agreement? There's only 8 steps to get this grant agreement. And we're going to just quickly go through each one of these again. This is a refresher for all of you, hopefully, but we just want to make it clear what the process is and why it takes so long. So you've got your award letter. As I said, the next step will be to talk to your project monitor. And this is a good time for you to really assess and say, okay, where are we? It's been quite a few months since we wrote that grant application. We've gotten more realistic quotes for some of the prices. We've actually started work and have found that things are going faster or slower than we anticipated. So really take a look and assess where things are now so that we can get as realistic a scope, timeline, and budget as possible. And be sure to be realistic about the timeline in particular, because we want to make sure that you have plenty of time to get this project done. Generally, we look for projects to be completed within 2 years maximum. So at least for your initial timeline, don't go beyond that 2 years. But that said, that doesn't mean that as you go through the process, if it is necessary and there's a valid reason for needing it, we could extend beyond those 2 years. But always add in some padding in terms of your timeline. And to be honest with you, when I do grant agreements for my folks anyway, I always tack a month or 2 extra on the end in addition to whatever you've built in. So I would say operate with your worst case scenario of how long things are taking, because the good news is you can always close out your grant early if things go very smoothly and you don't need that extra time. But if if things don't go as planned and you do need a little extra time, that saves some paperwork down the line because we don't need to do extensions and amendments quite so frequently. The other thing I'll say at this point is go ahead, if you know that there are going to be changes, go ahead and contact your project monitor now. You can be proactive about that. They may not have had a chance to really grab all their grants and start reaching out to everyone. So you can go ahead and email them. Their contact information is in your award letter, so you know who you need to talk to. And say, look, I know you haven't gotten back in touch with me yet, but I wanted to let you know our timeline has changed, our budget has changed, and here's what we're proposing. And that way you'll ensure that things keep moving. So once the project manager has that information and once we've gotten our boilerplate back from our legal folks, we will start to create a grant agreement. And again, the sooner you get all those updates to the project monitor, the sooner they can be working on that grant agreement for you. Once we've got that drafted, we send it to the Office of the Attorney General, to our legal counsel for review. And once they are happy with how it looks, we will send it out to you for signature. Now, we may get back in touch with you when the lawyers are looking at it, because sometimes they have questions that we didn't answer and that we couldn't glean from your application. So we may need to follow up with you for questions. So if we do follow up and say, look, the lawyer needs a little more detail on X, Y, or Z, again, get back to us as quickly as you can, because that keeps things moving. So once the legal counsel is happy with the draft grant agreement, they will send it out to you. This is your turn to sign. You are going to be the first one to sign this. You need to make sure that it is someone who is legally authorized from your organization to sign the grant agreement, and you will get multiple copies of all the signature pages, so make sure that you sign all the places you need to sign. There are multiple signature pages. There are multiple attachments that all need signed by that legally authorized signer. Suzanne, our grants manager, does a good job of marking all the different places to make sure that you've gone through and found all the tags where she's indicated that you need to sign or complete or initial or whatever it is at that point. Once you have signed in all the necessary spots, you send it back to us. We then send it to legal counsel again to just take a look again and make sure nothing has changed. They sign off on it, and then it goes to Baltimore for signature by the Department of Planning. Because MHT, where you're going to be sending all of your correspondence, is located in Crownsville. Baltimore is where the MDP offices are, so we have to send things back and forth there too. So unfortunately, there is a great deal of toing and froing involved here. Once MDP has signed, that is when the contract is a fully executed contract, and you will receive a fully executed copy back for your files. So that's it. Unfortunately, it's not a quick and easy process. It has a lot of back and forth, but the bottom line is the sooner you get stuff back to us, the sooner we can keep things moving in that process. And until we have a fully executed grant agreement, we cannot issue any payment. So again, it behooves you to keep things moving on your end, and we will do our best to keep things moving on our end. But the reality is you may not have a signed grant agreement until the end of the year. And again, if there are questions as I go, click that raise hand button or type something into chat. I'm just going to keep moving forward, but again, feel free to page me if you need me to pause on any of these or answer any questions. All right, the next piece is the grant document. And again, this is your legal contract. It is very important that you read through the entire contract and be familiar with it. It is also really important that you are not the only person in your organization that knows about this contract, that knows what this contract contains, that knows what the requirements of this contract are, because if you win the lottery and go off to the Bahamas, you need someone at your organization who can pick up where you left off and ensure that this contract gets completed, because even if you go, your organization is still bound by this contract. So it's really important that you make sure that there are multiple people in your organization who can be responsible for this, and not just you. It's also really important that you refer to this regularly. Obviously, you will be reading it through in its entirety when you have it signed by your legally authorized signer. But as you go through your project, it's important that you refresh your memory on the requirements that are included in this project. And we make that pretty easy for you. Obviously, the whole contract is important and you should read all of it. The first part of it is the legalese, and it's important, but it may not be project specific. The really project specific stuff is found in Exhibit A of your grant agreement. And we are actually going to go through Exhibit A. I have a sample that I've done. And if you downloaded the attachments that I sent via email, you can follow along on that as well. So to start with, your Exhibit A is going to cover your scope of work. And this is a very simple concept. Basically, do whatever's in the scope of work and don't do anything that isn't in the scope of work. So in our example, we have the Anywhere Heritage Exhibit and Brochure is their scope of work. They're going to be doing an exhibit. They're going to be hiring consultants. They're going to be designing and fabricating the exhibit and designing and printing brochures. So they can do the exhibit, and thank you to the B&O for letting me have this picture of this great exhibit that they did, supported by Heritage Area Funds. And They also are able to do brochures, and I think these are examples from Baltimore National Heritage Area. But their scope of work does not include a train ride, again, thanks to the B&O for the photo data. So it's that simple. If it's in the scope of work, you need to do it. If it's not in there, don't do it unless you get approval first. And that's the great thing about your grant project. We realize that there are changes and things change. So we may need to make changes to your scope of work, but you need to get approval first. Now, in terms of changing the scope of work, this isn't quite as easy as changing your timeline and budget. If it is minor changes to the scope of work, where sort of the end product is still going to be the same thing, but you have to tweak the steps a little bit. So if you know, you hadn't been planning on redesigning the brochure, so you didn't have costs for design in there, but you were going to get it reprinted, but now in doing research you've discovered that really you need to get it redesigned, so you need to shift some of the funds to design. The end product is still a brochure, so that's the type of change that we can probably do a staff approval on. But if, as in the case of this example, you decided you wanted to add train rides when all you were originally planned to do were an exhibit and a brochure, then that may need to go back to the Heritage Areas Authority for approval. And while, again, it's not impossible to do that, we would strongly encourage you to stick with smaller changes in scope unless absolutely necessary, simply because, you know, when we go back to the authority, we have no guarantee of what they're going to decide. And, you know, if they see that your project has taken such a severe shift, they could, in theory, say, you know what, this is too big a change. We're going to cancel this grant and have you come back in as a new application. Now, I'm not saying they would ever do that, but it does open it up to that possibility. So, again, if you need to tweak your scope of work, just keep in mind that we'd like to focus on smaller changes, and if it's really substantial, you might be better off just doing a new application for a new project the next year. So that's scope of work. The next section is timetable. And what we have done in the past and what's in the example that I'm showing you is a fairly detailed timetable where we itemize each step of the process just as you did in your application. I think, and we're finalizing the details on this, but I think what we're going to do this time around is we're going to really simplify this and just have your start, middle, and end date, and then your project completion date and your final report date. So you're going to have a really simplified timeline, and hopefully that will mean that we have to do less amendments to the timeline. So that's something that we're exploring doing, and you'll see that in your grant agreement when you get it. It may be a very simple timeline in that grant agreement. In terms of the timeline, the two most important dates that you need to remember are the project completion date and your final report date. Those two dates are the most critical, and it is the first of those two dates, the earlier of the two, the project completion date, that is the most important. This is the one that you need to put on your calendar. You need to set up reminders months in advance so that you know that it's coming. You need to make sure everyone in your organization knows that date, because that is the last date that you can do work on your grant project. It is the date that all funds must be expended, and most importantly, it's the last chance you can request an extension. So if your project completion date passes and you have not completed the work, you have not spent all of your money, you're in trouble, because we can't extend the grant after that point. And what that means is you risk having your grant canceled, you risk having to return money to us, and you risk not having a complete project, none of which we want to happen. And these are not empty threats, and they're not threats, they're just warnings. But we have had projects where we have had to reclaim funds because they did not complete the work by that project completion date. So really be mindful of that date. It's misleading because it's the earlier of the two dates, because what we do is we know you're focused on completing the project. We then give you another 2 months or so to complete the paperwork after you've done all the work. And that's the final report date. So that's, as it sounds like, is when the final report is due. That's when all of the paperwork is due. That's when your financial documentation is due. And we'll talk about all of that a little further on. But again, it's that first date that's super critical. If your final report comes in a little late, you know, a week or so late, it's not the end of the world. But if you don't need an extension and you haven't asked for it by that project completion date, there's not a whole lot we can do for you. And what this means is that you should be regularly reviewing your timeline, making sure that you're on track, and the instant that you think things have gotten off track and you may not make that deadline, give your project monitor a call. Say, look, this is what's going on. We're a little behind schedule. I'm not sure that we're going to make this deadline. Do you think we should request an extension just to be safe? And just talk it through with your project monitor. It's certainly easy enough to request an extension. Essentially, you can send your project monitor an email. We do need the request in writing. And you need to include the details of your grant, what fiscal year, what's the title of the grant, what was your original deadline, what's the new deadline, and what is the reason for asking for the extension. Just put that all in an email, shoot it off to your project monitor. They'll review it, and if they approve it, what they'll do is they'll generate an amendment letter. And we'll send that amendment letter out to you. Your legally authorized signer needs to countersign, and that's it. It's amended. So it's a straightforward process, but we can't just automatically do it. You need to ask for it and give us a reason why it's necessary. All right, the next section is special conditions. And these are conditions that relate to your specific project. So what you see in our sample may not be what's in your agreement because each project is different and each type of project has different special conditions that we add onto it. So, you know, things like if you're doing archaeology, you have to follow the state archaeological standards. If you're doing a brochure, you need to let us look at a draft of it before you go to print. If you're doing capital work, there's all kinds of conditions related to that. So the special conditions section is where you find all of those special conditions, and it is important that you look at it before you start any work. If you are in a position where you need to be doing work on your project now before you got your grant agreement, give your project monitor a call and say, look, I just want to make sure that I'm not, you know, violating any of these special conditions, because there are requirements that need to take place before starting work in some cases. Not all projects have this requirement, but there are some things where we need to approve drafts, we need to approve plans, we need to approve work strategy, and that will be in your special conditions section. The next section is your budget. And this is where, again, we are detailing what you can and cannot use your grant funds for and what you can and cannot use your matching funds for. On the whole, these cannot be switched. So if something was in your match column in your application and it's not in your, and you want to put it in the grant column, you need to ask us before you do that. And if you need to shuffle things around within existing line items, particularly large sums, if something has gone up in price significantly and you want to shift from another line item, that also requires approval unless it is less than 10% of your grant award. So if you had a $50,000 grant award, you can move around $5,000 within existing line items. If you need to add a line item, either for match or for grant funds, you need to get approval for that. And you need to document all expenditures, both grant expenditures and required match expenditures. And we will talk about that in depth in a few slides. Just a little refresher on match while we're talking about budget. Again, you are required to match your grant funds dollar for dollar at the 100% required match. Of that, 75% must be cash, and cash match can be cash expenditures either out of your own funds or with support from non-state grant or loan funds. And staff salary can also be used as part of your cash match, but not more than about a third of your total required match. And it can only be staff salary time working on the specific project. So you will need to log hours and log what they're doing. But that is something that can be included as your cash match, which is different from some other grant programs where they make salary be in-kind match. We allow that as part of your cash match. You may have up to 25% of your match as in-kind, and this can be volunteer time. So if you have volunteers working on the project, Their time can be used as in-kind. It can be donated professional services. So if, for example, you have an architect donating time to do plans for you, their time counts as an in-kind match. And donated materials, if someone has given you some building materials or whatever it is, that all counts as in-kind. The other thing that counts as in-kind, which often gets overlooked, is if someone is giving you a reduced rate for services, the difference between their full rate and the rate that they are charging you can also be used as in-kind match. So again, if that architect says, well, I'm not going to do it for you for free, but instead of charging you $100 an hour, I'm going to charge you $50 an hour, that $50 difference can be used as part of your in-kind match. You will also be documenting any additional grantee funding, and again, this is something that's shifting. I think we're going to actually be calling this other project costs, and it's also known as overmatch. And what this is we understand that a lot of times projects aren't going to cost just the amount of the grant funds and the required match funds, that a lot of times there's a lot more money going into this project than just those two chunks that we need detailed documentation on. And while we don't need you to document all those other project costs, we do want you to let us know what they are. And that's for two reasons. One is so that we can understand better what a particular type of project costs to complete, because we do get a lot of questions from folks saying, look, I'm thinking of doing X. Have you had others do this, and what did it cost? So that allows us to get a realistic sense of what it really costs to do an exhibit or whatever it is. The other reason we like to have that information is so that we can see how state funds are being leveraged with non-state funds, and we really want to get that full picture of what really we're leveraging with that state grant. So that's budget and matching funds. Any questions? Is everybody following along okay? Again, if you have a question, click the raise your hand button or just type it in the chat window. And if not, I will keep going. Just a couple reminders on things we can't pay for. We cannot pay for overhead fees for your organization. So that's things like utility bills, cost for the space where you're working in. We can't pay for staff salaries. However, if you are working with a partner organization, their staff can be considered a consultant, and we can pay consultant fees. And again, you can use staff salaries as part of your cash match as long as they are working on the project. The other thing we can't pay for with grant funds is project marketing. But again, you can include marketing as part of your match. And just as a reminder, you cannot use state funds for any of that required match. So that dollar-for-dollar match needs to be non-state funding sources. Just a quick note on procurement. Those of you with government entities, just follow your usual procurement procedures. We're not asking you to change whatever is established for your organization. Those of you who are in nonprofits, if a particular line item costs between $500 and $10,000, we would like to ask you to get written bids from 2 or more vendors, just so that we know that you're checking to make sure that your prices are reasonable. If you have expenditures on a particular item that are over $10,000, and this is for an item rather than your whole grant, we do want you to get written bids from at least 3 vendors. That said, you are not required to take the lowest bid. We just need you to be able to justify why you selected the vendor that you chose. We prefer not to see sole source procurement unless you have a valid reason for using that. And that can be things like, we requested bids from 6 different vendors and we only received bids from 1 because everyone else was too busy to deal with us, and this is a specialized area of work, so these were the only people qualified to do it. It could be that you are working on phase 5 of a project, and obviously the previous phases were done by this particular vendor, so you don't want to have to shift. Those are fine reasons. You just need to be able to articulate why you had to go with a sole source in those situations. All right, we are going to skip over the disbursement schedule. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a few slides and move on to reports. Again, the Exhibit A tells you when your reports are due, and they also tell you what deliverables they're tied to. So for heritage area grants, we tend to only have 2 reports, a mid-project report, which is roughly the middle of your project and is usually tied to a specific work product, and then a final report. For the mid-project report, it may not be the exact center date in your timeline. We generally try and look at a point where you've done about half the work on your project. So that may be that, you know, if you have a long timeline and you have a front-loaded process, you may be doing a mid-project report a lot sooner, or if things are really slow to get started on your project, your mid-project report may fall closer to the end than the middle. And we'll work that out with you as we craft your grant agreement. The mid-project report, there is no specific form that you need to use. It's simply a narrative report. We ask you to tell us where you are. What have you done to date? Are there any problems? What have been the successes so far? What are the next steps? So you will just type that up as a narrative, and then you can send that back with a disbursement request form, which we will talk about. And that's your mid-project report. It can be very easy. There's no required length. It's just however much space you need to give us a good report on where things stand. The final report comes after everything on your project has been completed and all expenditures have been made. Again, there's no set form unless you have a capital project, in which case there will be a set form that you need to use. And again, it's a narrative for most of you. Tell us what was great about the project. Tell us what unexpected things happened. Tell us the problems that you ran into and how you fixed them. Tell us about the great press that you got on the project, or the new things that have arisen as a result of this project. All of that is great information for us to have, so make sure you include it in your final report. You'll send in that report along with the disbursement request form and full financial documentation. That's all part of your final report. And your final payment will not be made until that final report is submitted. So your last payment is always reimbursable because you can't do your final report until all expenditures have been made. And remember, that final report comes 2 months after your project completion date, although you're welcome to submit it sooner if you wish. So again, just to go over your responsibilities, please keep to your timetable. We want things to be completed on time. We want everything to be expended and completed by that project completion date. And if you aren't keeping on time, make sure that you ask for an extension as soon as possible, as soon as you know you're off track. Make sure you keep to your budget. Don't move more than 10% around unless you have prior authorization. Don't make changes to the line items without prior approval. And please also make sure that you acknowledge support wherever possible. So this includes making sure that our logo or statement of support is on all products. This can be a logo or statement of support on a brochure, a sign up in a new exhibit, a sign posted at a construction site, wherever that is. It's also good to acknowledge the support of your local heritage area. You wouldn't be where you are now without the help of your local heritage area, so be sure to give them acknowledgement as well. Make sure that you invite us to any events that you have, opening events, ribbon cuttings, whatever it is, because a lot of times authority members do like to come and participate, and it's a great way to show off what you've done. If you were talking to the press about your project, remember to mention where your funding support came from, because it's really important that we get that out there, that partial support for your project came from the Heritage Areas program. Our elected officials certainly read these kind of press releases, and it's good for them to see the good things that are coming out of this program so that they continue to support it in future years so that we can continue to give grants. And again, this is why we ask for drafts a lot of times before you go into production to make sure that we've got a logo on there. So be sure you do that before you produce a document, and try and do it with enough lead time that we have a few days to look it over. So don't send it to us at 4 o'clock in the afternoon and say, we're sending this to press tomorrow morning. Let me know if there's any problems. Give us a couple days to look at it before you need to go to press. Another responsibility you have is to stay in compliance with the Department of Assessments and Taxation. When you applied, should have been in good standing, and we did check that prior to award. But obviously, that status can change as you go through your project. And what we don't want to see happen is that your payments get held up because you are no longer in good standing. We have had situations where a grantee has submitted a disbursement request, and we have sent it for processing. It goes to the comptroller, and because the organization owed back taxes, the comptroller just kept that check. They did never issue a payment on your grant. So we don't want you to forfeit one of your grant payments because you aren't in good standing with SSTAT. So be sure to keep on top of that as you go through your project. And this year we have 2 new items that are your responsibility that you will need to take care of. These both are going to happen at the start, concurrently with getting your grant agreement signed. The first is that we need you to send us an official hard copy of your Certificate of Good Standing. This is something that you can purchase and download from SSTAT. The link is there. And you need to include that with your signed grant agreement. But don't go and rush out and print it out today, because we need that certificate to be issued within 30 days of when you sign your grant agreement. So what I would recommend, because it is such a quick process and you can do it automatically online, wait until you're ready to put that signed grant agreement back in the mail, and then purchase and print your Certificate of Good Standing. This is one of the new requirements that our new lawyer has instituted. If you have any questions on this, let me know and I will help you figure that out. But again, just make sure you include that with your grant agreement when you send it back. The second piece is another new item from our lawyer, and it is a certificate and corporate resolution of the grantee. This document will be included with your grant agreement materials, and it consists of a resolution that your governing body needs to pass, and it then needs to also have a list of signatures of those who are legally authorized to sign or enter into contracts for your organization. So this is another thing that you're going to have to get some signatures on. You're going to have to get a resolution passed. If you are with an organization that has a long lead time on getting a document like this process, like you need to go through public hearings or anything, let me know. We can send you a copy of that in advance of your grant agreement so that you can be working on it now. And again, this is a new requirement. We're still figuring out the ramifications of this. So when you get this, if you have any questions at all, don't hesitate to contact your project monitor or me or Richard, and we'll help you figure out what needs to happen on that piece. Both of those are new items for this year. You won't have done these before, so this is important that you're aware that there's these new requirements. Any questions on those pieces? Just click the raise hand or type it into the chat. I do believe I got a question of whether this applies to government entities, and I believe it does. I will verify that with our legal folks and get back to you, but I believe it does have to be passed for government agencies as well. Any other questions on that piece? Okay. Let's talk for a bit about financial reporting requirements, because this is one of the biggest stumbling blocks, and even though we have folks who come in year after year, we still have to go over this every year. So I want to make sure everybody knows what the requirements are. Again, we are looking to spend state funds responsibly, and that we have well-documented, cost-effective operations that are following proper procurement. And what you can do to ensure that is, when you are looking at costs and when you are looking at your expenditures, make sure that it is eligible and necessary. Is it a reasonable cost, and can you verify that cost? And again, grant funds can only be spent on the parts of the budget that are set forth as being paid for with grant funds. Unless you have prior approval, if the expenditure does not fall into the grant column in your approved budget in your grant agreement, you can't use grant funds to support those line items, whatever they are. As I mentioned before, we do a series of disbursements that are tied to your reports. Your first disbursement is the easiest one to get. You will have a disbursement request form included with your grant agreement, and if you got my email earlier this morning, there is a copy of that disbursement request form there, so you can take a look at it. The first one that you receive, the only thing you need to do is have your legally authorized signer sign it, send it back with a grant agreement, and as soon as that grant agreement is executed, your first disbursement will be issued. Generally, the first disbursement is 25% of your grant award. Now, if you have a project that needs more funds up front for whatever reason, talk to your project monitor as you're creating that draft grant agreement, and we can usually shuffle things around a little if you need a little more up front, or if your project is really front-loaded or a short timeline. The second disbursement request, which is usually 50% of the award, comes along with your mid-project report. We cannot process that disbursement request until you have submitted the mid-project report. This time you have the same disbursement request form, but this time you need to fill out the budget line items in the request form. And the way you do that is you are going to have exactly the same line items that appear in your grant agreement, and you're going to record what was originally awarded. And then in the white columns, you're going to record what you have spent to date. Now, it doesn't matter how much of the grant you have completed by that point. You can still request the full 50% for your mid-project disbursement. Now, you can't ask for any more than that, but if you have not yet spent up to 75%, counting your initial disbursement and that mid-disbursement, that's okay. You can still request those funds as long as you've submitted that mid-project report and completed the budget form on there. The final disbursement request is part of your final report. And again, this comes after all grant work is complete because this comes after the project completion date. So we reserve what is generally 25% of the grant for the very end, and that is a reimbursable expense because, again, you need to have spent all of your funds and expended all of that before the project completion date. With your final report, you will again do a disbursement request form detailing all of the expenditures, but this time you also need to include proof of those expenditures and proof of payment. You don't need to include any of that supporting documentation with your mid-project. You only need to include it with your final disbursement request. And that includes receipts, invoices, canceled checks, timesheets, all of that financial documentation needs to be included with the final report. And you will not get that final payment until your final report is approved. It's really important that you keep good records throughout the project, and I would recommend that you keep them as you go rather than trying to recreate it at the end. It's very hard at the end of the project to recreate what happened, particularly in terms of timesheets. So did Joe come in for 5 days in October or 10 days in May? And those kind of conversations make it very hard at the end and make the final reporting process much more difficult. So make sure that you're keeping timesheets, make sure you're saving those receipts, make sure you are getting proof of payment, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a couple slides. Whatever kind of things that you are going to need to document as part of that financial documentation, make sure you're keeping records as you go. You can just have a folder for each project and just keep those all in there, log your volunteer time, log your staff time, and keep that going. All of these records that you keep must be retained. We get audited at the state level, and sometimes the auditors want to look at your piece of the project file as well. So what that means is you need to keep your grant files for 5 years from the project completion. So when you have submitted that final report, that starts the 5-year clock ticking. So you need to keep that file for 5 years from the end of the project. All right, the next section we're going to cover primarily deals with capital projects, although it may also involve projects touching on archaeology or other kinds of ground disturbance, signage, those kinds of things. So it may not apply to all of you, but it's good information to have in case you come in for a future grant that does touch on these areas. If you have a project that is a capital project, bricks and mortar, ground disturbance, any of those kind of activities, you need to, before you do anything else, find out the answers to these questions. Is there an easement on your property? Are you required to donate or modify an easement on your property? And if there isn't an easement requirement, do you need to complete compliance review? And we have two great ladies on our staff that will help you answer these questions. Amy Skinner, who deals with easements, and Amanda Apple, who deals with compliance. And these are the two that you need to work closely with before starting work, because you need to know the answers to these questions before you do anything else. Let's just look briefly at easements. For those of you who aren't aware, an easement is a legal contract between the property owner, not necessarily the organization, but the property owner and the state, that basically transfers part of the real property rights, the development rights on that property to the state. When we get these easements donated, they're each unique to the property. So each one is different. Each one encompasses different things. It might be for just a small portion of the property. It might just be for the exterior of your structure. It might be for the interior. It might be for archaeology. Each one is different, and it is negotiated with the property owner to ensure that everybody's interests are being taken into account. And what the easement does is it prevents inconsistent changes on the property that would impact the preservation of that historic resource. It also means that the state then has legal authority and responsibility to enforce the terms of that easement, which can include required inspections of the property, review and approval of any changes to that property, which is the key piece for your grant project, because it is most likely that the work you're going to do on the property is something that will need to be reviewed and approved before you begin work. And it also allows them, again, to enforce the requirements of that easement, and if it's not upheld, the ability to require the reversal of unapproved work or other penalties. And we certainly don't want to see you get in a situation like that. So we want to make sure that you get all of the necessary approvals before beginning work. And again, an easement is perpetual. It conveys with the property, and it is tied to the land records of that property. So it's not just your organization, it is future organizations as well. So that's an important thing to understand and keep in mind. If you are required to convey an easement, you will be working closely with Anne, who you see in the lower right corner there, and she's our easement processor. Conveying an easement is sort of a long legal process, so we don't require that you have this completed before you begin work. What we require is that it is recorded before you get your final disbursement at the end of the project. That said, if you are conveying an easement, you need to operate as if that easement were already in place and get all of the necessary approvals if you would like to start work. And to get approval for work under an easement, you will need to submit a checklist and change/alteration application. This is available on our website. The link is listed there. And when you are completing this application, you need to make sure that you're including as much detail as possible. That includes maps, that includes drawings, that includes material specifications. No one has ever gotten in trouble for including too much detail. What we do get into a lot is that not enough information is given, and that then delays the process. Because what happens when you submit a change alteration email is that you then go before the MHT easement committee. And you can see members of the easement committee here. They represent a multidisciplinary group of MHT staff members. They meet every 3 weeks. You can find that schedule on the MHT website, as well as the submission deadlines for each meeting, which is important to know if you're on a timeline, because you want to make sure that there's plenty of time to get these approvals in place before you need to start work. So once the application is reviewed by the committee, if it is complete, they will make recommendations to the MHT director, Rodney Little, and he will send you a letter notifying you of the determination. If, however, your application is incomplete, and that goes back to making sure you include as much information as possible, they may send it back to you requesting more information. And what that means is that then just delays the process, because then you'll have to go back to them, give them more information, and then it goes back to the committee again. So again, be as complete as possible when you are making these submissions. If you have any questions or concerns about what you need to submit, contact Amy. She can help you figure out what you need to provide for them. Once you receive approval for the work, it is valid for 6 months. If for whatever reason you were delayed or the work takes longer, you may need to get an extension for that approval. If you haven't made any changes or you've made it relatively shortly after the 6 months has ended, that usually is a staff approval, which means you don't have to go back to the committee, but sometimes you may need to go back to the committee. So just be aware of that expiration of the approval. For those of you who have capital projects or ground disturbance or archaeology that doesn't involve an easement, you will be required to go through what's known as compliance review. And this is a requirement where there is state or federal involvement in a project, and so in this case there's a state grant. And the project or undertaking needs to be assessed to see what impact it has on historic properties. And the process seeks to minimize any kind of adverse effects on those historic resources. So you'll be working with the compliance staff. Generally, for MHAA grants, we work with Amanda Apple, who's in the middle there. But some of you may have projects that are longer or stretch beyond the boundaries of your grant project, and you may be working with some other member of the compliance team. In any event, again, you need to get approval for work before beginning work. And those of you that do need to go through compliance review, you should have received a copy of the project review form with your award letter. Again, make sure you complete this with as much detail as possible and include maps, site plans, detailed descriptions of work, all of those good things. And I should say for both this and the easement, you need to submit these in hard copy. You can't submit them in electronic copy because a lot of times there's big attachments and our systems can't handle them. So make sure that you are submitting in hard copy. Once the compliance staff receive your application, they have a 30-day turnaround on approval, and they will give you recommendations and changes. And part of your grant agreement is going to say that you need to follow the recommendations of the compliance review. So if they say you need to change how you do something, you may need to change how you do something. Whatever you do, just make sure that you are getting those approvals in place, because obviously we don't want our inspectors to get angry, because as you can see, we have very fierce inspectors here at MHT, and we want to make sure that they are happy. And as with all things, if you are working through either an easement process or a compliance process and you are running into problems, be sure to talk to your project manager, because again, remember, this is happening in a different arm of MHT, so we may not be as fully engaged in that process, but we do try and talk to these folks, and we can help with any issues and see if there are confusions or misunderstandings, and help you work through those. So if you're having problems, just pick up the phone, call your project monitor and say, look, I don't understand what's happening. Can you help work through this with me? The bottom line is you need to talk to us. Whatever is going on with your project, you need to talk to us, because we want you to succeed at this. We want this to be a strong project. We want you to have great outcomes, and we want this to not be a painful process for you. We want this to be a smooth process getting you through all of these requirements. Before I wrap things up and before I open it up to questions, I just want to go over a few other little details. We get a lot of questions on how you value volunteer time. And the source that we use to come up with that value is an organization called Independent Sector. The website is listed there. Currently, the rate for volunteer time in Maryland is $23.05. So that's the value that you can use to value your volunteer time. Now, if you go to that website and you want to check and see what the most up-to-date value is, you'll see at the top of the page that there's a national volunteer rate, and then if you scroll down, there's state-by-state rates. We use the Maryland-specific rate because it's actually higher than the national rate, so that works out nicely for you. The one exception to this is if you have, again, a professional who's volunteering their time in their professional capacity, you can then value their time at their professional rate. So again, that architect, if he normally charges $100 an hour and he's doing it for you for free, you can value his time at $100 an hour. But that's only if he's working as an architect. If he is just showing up and helping to rake the leaves or something, then you have to use the $23.05 rate. Another question we get a lot is, what does good financial documentation look like? Again, we need to see two pieces of this equation. We need to see evidence of the expenditure, whether it's an invoice, a timesheet, a volunteer log, or a receipt. And we need to see proof that you paid that invoice. Proof of payment can be a canceled check. It can be a copy of your bank statement with the photocopies of the check and the line items highlighted. Obviously, a receipt isn't all-in-one because it's obviously proof you paid it and it shows that you've purchased it, although it is good to get itemized receipts if possible so that we know what you purchased. Pay stubs for staff time is another good one to show proof of payment, but you need to have both sides of that equation. And when you are submitting to us, be as organized as possible in how you're recording, because a lot of times if it's a big project, there's lots and lots of different expenditures. And sending us a huge box of paper that is completely disorganized and makes no sense only slows down the process of getting your final payment, because we can't make hide nor hair of how you got the numbers on your budget. And what we want to see is that the budget on your disbursement request form aligns with the documentation that you're providing. And the best way to do that is to make sure that each piece of documentation is labeled to correspond with each line item in your budget. So you can, probably the best way that I've seen it is that you number each line item on your disbursement form, and then for each piece of documentation that ties to that line item, put that number in the top right corner as well. So if you have 6 invoices relating to brochure printing, label them all number 1, label it that line item number 1 on your disbursement request, and then also make sure that you've got each of the pieces of the equation. So for each invoice, make sure that stapled to it or copied on the back of it, or however you want to organize it, you have proof of payment as well. And then put them in the order, and maybe even paperclip each line item's documentation together and put a sticky on the front. So this is all brochure printing. Next one is, this is all exhibit fabrication costs. Next one is, these are all event costs, whatever it is. And then when you send us the package, put them in order, in the same order that they're on your disbursement request form. That way, when we're going through, we can easily see where the totals came from, what you were considering part of this line item and not part of that line item, because a lot of times it's not real clear. If you have a lot of sort of similar line items, it's not clear where you allocated each invoice. So that makes it a lot easier for us to understand where things go. Now, I will say, and we're going to be talking about this in just a minute, the report submission process is going to be changing over the next year because we are shifting to an online grant system. So you may not need to be sending in paper versions of all of these. We probably will have you scan them and upload them, but the same principle applies. Make sure that when you're scanning it in, you have the invoice and proof of payment on subsequent pages so they're in order, and make sure you number them or label them so that we can tell which pieces go with which line item. It's the same principle, just make it very easy for us to understand how those all fit together. Another question we get a lot is this disbursement form and how it gets completed, because we've got a lot of different columns and a lot of times folks get confused. So I just want to go over it again. Again, if you downloaded this from the email attachments, you can follow along. This disbursement budget should match exactly your approved budget, whether it's in the budget that's in your grant agreement or if you had changes made and you've got an amendment letter. Whatever the latest version of that budget is, this budget on your disbursement form should match that. It should have exactly the same line items. It should list the awarded amounts for each of the different columns in the white columns. So the grant funds awarded, what you had budgeted for match, and what additional project cost you had budgeted. that should all match exactly what's in your latest approved budget. The gray columns are where you put where you are to date. So if it's your mid-project report, it's what you've spent to that point. If it's your final report, it's the final expenditures for each of those. So those go in the gray column, and then you total them in the far right column. Please also make sure that you do total up each column and total up each row. It makes our lives so much easier if we can see all the totals there. And again, if you're having trouble with this, refer back to your grant agreement budget and go back to that approved budget and make sure that this aligns. Another question we run into on occasion, thankfully not very often, is something along the lines of, I was given a grant to do something, but the easement committee says I can't do that. The first thing I'll say about this is that we do work very closely with the easement staff, and they are consulted before we even make the award to make sure that what you want to do is something that would be approved under the easement or compliance. So that shouldn't happen. The other thing to keep in mind is that the easement committee rarely says no flat out. They may say, no, you can't do it that particular way, but they rarely say, no, you absolutely can't do that. Usually there are alternative approaches for whatever it is you want to do that would be approved, and we just need to work with the easement committee to work that out. Again, this is a consultative process. We want to work with you to make sure that we get this working for everyone. If you run into something like this, call your project monitor. We will help you sort it out. Because again, we want you to have a great grant experience. We do not want you to have a frustrating grant experience. It's in everybody's interest to have this go smoothly and have a great outcome at the end of your project. Before I open it up to questions, I just want to update you on the grant software that I mentioned a little bit earlier. We are in the process of implementing a grant software system, and what this means is that for fiscal year 2015, your grant applications, if you're coming in next year, will come in online. You will be submitting online, and what that also means for you as a fiscal year 2014 grantee is that you will be, at some point in the next 6 months probably, pulled into the system. And the reason we're going to pull you into the system is because that will allow you to submit all of your reports and your disbursement requests online through the software system. Now, don't worry, we're going to hold training sessions before we do this to get you up to speed, but at some point in the near future, your organization will be receiving an invitation email to create an account. And what this means a lot of different things, and we are really excited about this system. It's been a long time coming, and I think it's going to make everybody's lives easier. One of the biggest things it means is that when you are applying for a grant, you no longer will have to submit 12 copies of everything. You will only need to submit 1 hard copy. Everything will be submitted online. You'll just print out a hard copy for signature, and that is it. Other things that you'll be able to do, you'll be able to update your organizational information and contact information online. You won't have to call anybody to get it updated. You can just do that yourself. Any reports, photos, or other submissions can be submitted online, again, saving you postage costs. When you're applying for a grant, or if you've been awarded a grant, you will be able to check your status, see where it is in the review process, see if you have reports due. The system will also send you automatic reminders about deadlines, which is really great for us, and it's really great for you because that means when your project completion date is coming up, you will get automatic reminders saying, hey, it's coming up, you need to think about whether or not you need an extension. So all of these things are coming very soon. Again, there will be training. We will work with you to get you on board with that, but it should be really great and hopefully will mean that things get processed a lot faster as well. So we're really excited about that and really excited to show you the system, but just to give you a sneak peek, this is sort of what it's going to look like. You will go to a login page to create a login. You will click New Applicant there under Email and create an account for your organization. And then when you're doing reports or applying for a grant, you'll just be completing forms like this online. So it's really exciting. We're really looking forward to having that soon, and you will be hearing more from us on that point in the future. One other thing that I don't think I mentioned at all during this presentation, again, for your project, you can be working on it now, even though you don't have a grant agreement. July 11th is the start of your grant period, and your grant period runs from July 11th to your project completion date. So all grant expenditures need to happen within that time frame. All match expenditures need to happen in that time frame. So you can be working on your project now. Just remember that you need to check and make sure there aren't any requirements before you start work, that there aren't things that you need to be taking care of. We are going to be working on those grant agreements. Again, I apologize for the delay on those. You can go ahead and touch base with your project monitors, let them know what changes are going to need to be made so that as soon as we've got that boilerplate ready to go, we can start cranking out those agreements and get those out to you as soon as possible. So that's what I've got for you today. I'm happy to open it up to questions. Again, if you want to click raise your hand or type a question into the chat, I can answer any questions that you have. If you don't have any questions, you can leave us now, or you can hang out and listen and see what other questions there are. Again, I will be making this recording available online. I'll make sure you all get the link to that, so if you need to go back and refresh it, your memory on that, you can certainly do that. All right. And Mayor Klein, I see you have a question. I'm going to unmute you, and you can go ahead and ask your question.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. This is all very informative. Even though I've gone through it before, I learned a lot. Thank you so much. My question has to do with our project monitor. When will we know the name of that individual?
Your project monitor is in your award letter, so you should already have that.
I've overlooked that. Okay, we'll look at that.
Yeah, and I don't know off the top of my head who's doing yours. I think it might be Richard, but actually, no, that's one of mine, so I will be your project monitor.
Well, that's
your award letter as well.
That is good news. Thank you so much. All right, we'll be talking with you soon. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And Susan, let's see, the 2-year window starts July 11th or the date MDP signs the agreement. That's a great question. The 2-year window starts we're actually working on this with our lawyer, but I believe where we're going to end up is the 2-year window will start when the grant agreement is executed. But really, it's based on the timeline of your project. And if you're starting work July 11th, then let's try and stick to a 2-year window from July 11th. But if you're not starting work until January, then do a 2-year window from there. And again, that's the goal. It's not to say that it can't go beyond that. If you have a big capital project, obviously it may go beyond that. But again, try and keep it to a 2-year window. If you're really struggling and it needs to be more than that, talk to your project monitor and they can work with you to get that timeline sorted out. Other questions? If you have questions, feel free to raise your hand, type it into the chat. And if not, I'll say thank you to everyone. I'll hang out for a few minutes in case somebody thinks of a question, but thank you for participating. I have logged all of you so you get credit for being here because, of course, you've just met one of the requirements of your grant agreement, so congratulations on that. And good luck on your projects. We've got a lot of great things going on, and we really look forward to working with you in the coming year. And again, I'll hang out, so if you have questions, don't hesitate to ask, and thank you so much.